Alvin, we sit here in your gracious living room on the morning of Monday, August the 6th, Hiroshima Day. Now, I think it was 3 years ago at the Bishops' Conference, Methodist Bishops' Conference at the Pollard Auditorium here, I heard you for the first time talk about your idea of the sanctification of Hiroshima. That's a very big idea. I'm not sure that I understand it fully. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Once the atom bomb is invented, it's impossible to disinvent it. And so humankind is going to have to live with the bomb forever. 10,000 years, 100,000 years, however long the human race exists, assuming that we don't relapse into a kind of primitive recidivism, which some people say might happen, but I don't think so. I think we will be intelligent enough, and being intelligent enough, we will have bombs forever. And the question then is, how do you live, not for the next 5 years, not the next 10 years, not the next 100 years, but forever with the nuclear bomb? And so it seemed to me that what was necessary was to impose on the whole idea of the bomb a kind of doctrine, a kind of ambience that would last forever. And you begin to think of what are the human beliefs that last essentially for all time. And the only beliefs that I could come up with were, of course, religious beliefs. The Catholic Church has been going for 2,000 years. There are Buddhist temples in Nepal that have been going continuously for 4,000 and 5,000 years. And so I began thinking, is it possible to create somehow a religious significance around the event at Hiroshima, which would then pass into somehow the basic religious beliefs of all humankind? Now, I came to this view some 5 years ago at the 40th anniversary of the Hiroshima Day, when it appeared to me that all of this huge outpouring of public manifestations, people congregating, making speeches, that the whole thing seemed to me to begin having a somewhat religious significance, in the sense that people were praying for peace. People were making out of Hiroshima an event, an international event that's almost unprecedented. You begin to think of it, what other event has mobilized so many people on a given occasion? I suppose Earth Day has, in some sense, and 100 million people mobilized. But I think Hiroshima Day also has that significance. And as I think of it, one must realize that in a certain sense, this whole business of planet Earth is acquiring a kind of religious significance. And in that same sense, I would think of Hiroshima acquiring this kind of significance. Now, I also came to these ideas when people would ask me, well, do you feel guilty about being involved in the Hiroshima business? Actually, I wasn't directly involved in the Hiroshima business, because the part of the project during the war that I was involved in was aimed at producing plutonium, which went into the Nagasaki weapon, not into the Hiroshima weapon. Hiroshima, of course, was U-235, which is what is produced here in Oak Ridge and was produced during the war. But as I began thinking about it, I realized that to sanctify an event, to make an historical event into a religious event, and that's what I mean by the sanctification of Hiroshima, there must be something very, very special about that event. It must be terrible. And you think about the events that have established religion, I suppose the most terrible event in Christianity was the crucifixion. Now, you think then about the 100,000 people who were killed in Hiroshima, and you ask, were we justified? my view has always been the simple-minded one, that really saved a large number of lives because it ended the war, and we didn't have to invade Japan, which would have meant maybe 500,000 or 1 million people dying. But I guess I would then think that because the event was so terrible, it has the power, the significance, to allow it to become the basis for a sanctification. You sanctify a terribly important, terrible event. You don't sanctify an everyday event. And so I suppose I would finally say that the 100,000 at Hiroshima, who in a sense were martyrs in the short run because their deaths meant the end of the war. And so they saved lots of other people from dying. But in the larger sense, I think they are martyrs to the sanctification of Hiroshima, that because they died, because it was so terrible, so unprecedented an event, there is this possibility, as the years go by, that people will erect essentially religious taboos about the use of nuclear weapons in war. And that's what I mean by the sanctification of Hiroshima. Of course, I'm not going to be around 1,000 years from now, and so I don't know whether this is really going to happen. And we talk here on August 6, 1990, just a couple of days after Iraq has moved. I hope that that doesn't mean that we're going to have to use atomic bombs. But as a matter of fact, I suspect the Iraq situation isn't going to lead to nuclear.
Well, do you see this process of sanctification, which I would assume is a very gradual evolutionary process? You just talked about 1,000 years. Are you thinking in terms of 1,000 years that it'll take for that to happen? Do you think it's happening? We had, I think the estimate I saw was 150 people demonstrating out at the Y-12 gates yesterday. Should more of us have been out there? Is that part of the moving towards the sanctification of it, or is this not necessarily anything we can do anything about? It's either going to happen or it's not going to happen.
I don't think we can do very much about it. I think that there will be a widespread and increasingly widespread common understanding among all peoples that nuclear weapons are no-nos. Now, does that common understanding exist now? I think in the Western world it does largely exist. I don't think that it exists in Islam. The fact that Pakistan probably has the makings of an atomic bomb, the fact that Iraq certainly wants an atomic bomb, the fact that Gaddafi tried to get an atomic bomb but was unsuccessful. So I cannot say that this is really going to happen, and yet I would, in answer to your question, say that if it happens, it will, of course, be gradual. I don't know how fast it will happen. The 45th anniversary somehow doesn't carry the same weight as, say, the 50th anniversary. And let's wait for the 50th anniversary and then the 100th anniversary. But as we celebrate it, or mark it, memorialize it every 10 years, I think you will find that it will become part of the common culture and will eventually acquire what might be called a mythic significance.
Alvin, last night I heard one of the Knoxville television stations hype a series that they're going to do later this week, and the title of it is Oak Ridge, Paying the Price for the Past. And of course it's about the waste situation here. How do you react to that kind of a title, for paying the price for the past? There's a clear implication of...
No, I think it's justified. You must realize that when Oak Ridge was founded in 1943, when Hanford was built in 1943, 1944, we were at the very beginning of the atomic age. We had really no experience to speak of in handling massive amounts of radioactivity. And therefore we did what was expedient. And so I've sometimes said that atomic energy extracts a price. And the price on the one hand is the requirement to handle things very, very carefully. Because if you don't handle them all that carefully, then in effect you are interdicting certain pieces of land. And I guess it's fair enough to say that the land in the Nevada test site, where there have been, I don't know, 1,000 or so nuclear explosions, that land, at least down where the craters are, is radioactively contaminated, and it will remain radioactively contaminated for a very long time. At Oak Ridge, the contamination is far less serious than that, but nevertheless, there is land that has been contaminated. I guess the answer, the point that I would make is that this is one of the prices that nuclear energy extracts. Namely, the commitment of certain pieces of land to surveillance for a very, very long time, possibly to interdiction for certain uses. Well, then one says, is that something that we can live with? And I would insist very, very strongly that of course we can live with that, and the reason is the following, that the number of places that are so interdicted must remain small. In the United States, for example, we have about 80 sites where reactors are operating. In addition, we have perhaps 15 other sites where radioactivity is handled on a very, very large scale in a somewhat labile form, and therefore lends itself much more easily to a possible contamination of land than the reactor sites themselves. But I think that if we are to use atomic energy on a large scale, and well, especially because of the greenhouse effect, we might come back to it, I think there's no alternative to using atomic energy on a large scale, then one of the fundamental principles must be that atomic energy must be confined to just a very few sites. In the United States, not more than about 100 places, which are radioactive sites or partly radioactive sites where nuclear energy is done, and that is the price that we pay for this essentially inexhaustible source of energy. Now, that doesn't mean that one cannot and one will not improve the situation very much, especially at Hanford. I think we will improve the situation, but I doubt whether, taking the Nevada test site, that you will ever be able to get rid of the radioactivity that's down in the craters. It's pretty deep down.
How about down in the bottom of Watts Bar Lake, as is alleged?
Well, we can talk about that for a moment. In the first place, as far as I understand, it's very unlikely that material will be resuspended. But the other point is that Watts Bar Lake, the level of contamination is extremely low. It's extremely low. And so this whole question of the fear that this low-level contamination seems to evoke in the public and in the press is related to the fact that people are very, very uncomfortable even about the tiniest amount of radiation, at least if that radiation is associated with nuclear energy. If it's associated with traveling in an airplane, I just came back from Vancouver, and I received, I don't know, about 3 milliroentgens of radiation coming from Vancouver here because I was high up in the airplane. As long as it's radiation up in the sky, people aren't worried about it. If it's radiation, even at those very, very low levels, which is associated with nuclear energy, people look upon it rather differently. I think that's really quite irrational.
Alvin, there was a report in the Oak Ridger last week of a woman, I believe from Ohio, who had written to Mayor Pruitt and had said, in effect, we've been to Oak Ridge, we're planning to move there, it's a charming community, but we're planning to live, I think she mentioned one of the newest subdivisions out in the West End. She said, can you assure me that I'm not endangering my family by moving to Oak Ridge. How would you answer a letter like that if you get it?
Rather than endangering her family, she was assuring her family a much better life. I mean, Oak Ridge is an extraordinarily nice place to live. It's a great place to raise one's children.
But what about all the contamination?
Well,
they dug up
contamination is just not of that order. I mean, living in a city is far more hazardous as far as contamination is concerned than living in Oak Ridge. I mean, there's no possibility of any of these contaminants, radioactive or for that matter, mercury contamination, causing any human harm. It's just that we've got very, very sensitive to these things, and we now seem to want an environment that is completely pure of all man-made insults, forgetting, of course, that nature itself is insulting. There are all sorts of natural insults that actually are much more serious than any radioactivity that's in Oak Ridge. So I would respond to this lady and say, lady, you're making the right decision. Come to Oak Ridge. I can assure you that your children will have a great and long life, and you will live longer, because I think it probably is true. People who work at the plants here in Oak Ridge, on the average, have a considerably longer life expectancy than the population average. I'm 75 years old now, by the way. I'm doing fine.
On that note, I've heard it discussed, and I've thought myself sometimes, some people a little bit older than you sort of ending their lives, some people not in as good health as you are, people who were associated here in the early days, who worked hard for the original mission and for the later missions. Do you see, to any extent, some personal tragedies happening, that these people are ending their lives at a time when the technology is being disparaged and all of these problems are being, and things like paying the price for the past and incompetence and insensitivity out at Hanford and places like that are being talked about? Do you suppose there are some people who really are personally hurt by this?
Well, they may be. I personally am not hurt in the slightest. Let me just speak to the question of incompetence. You must realize that the standards that are imposed on the handling of radioactivity today are enormously stricter than they were 45 years ago when Hanford was built. And at every point, the standards that were adopted in deciding where to dispose of things, how to handle them, were always the standards that were approved by all of the regulatory bodies. So that one cannot speak of incompetence at all. Short-sightedness, yes, I suppose there is a certain short-sightedness. I don't think, although some people had called attention to the fact that keeping the wastes in liquid form in these tanks for a very long time is probably not a good thing to do. And therefore, I think it is fair to say that because of the Cold War, because money was always limited, the production of the materials for making hydrogen bombs was the highest priority, because we really felt at the time that there was a possibility of a nuclear war. And therefore, the money that could have been used to solidify the waste 30 years ago, and the technology was more or less available at that time, this technology was not pursued. And so I suppose in that respect, the whole enterprise can be described as being, I guess the word is penable, that we did not have enough foresight to realize that even though we were fighting the Cold War, we had to get the money to do the thing right in the first place. But there were all these enormous pressures. And in fact, as I look back on my own tenure at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I ask myself, what really should I have done differently? I suppose the thing that I should have done differently was to have insisted that very much more money went into the handling of the radioactive liquid waste than went into it. Well, we brought these questions up to the Atomic Energy Commission on many occasions, and we were always told we don't have the money to do it. So that from that point of view, I suppose I absolve myself of the responsibility, but I don't think that's quite fair, because had I felt that the issue was really the central issue, or one of the central issues on which the whole future of the nuclear enterprise depended, I would have spent very much more time pounding the table. I remember having an interesting conversation with Glenn Seaborg not very long ago, who at that time, or during that time, was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And I said, Tim, Glenn, why didn't we spend very much more money to solidify the waste, get them out of the tanks and have a much more permanent solution? And Glenn always said to me on several occasions that he wanted to do that, but the Office of Management and Budget, at that time called the Bureau of the Budget, simply wouldn't listen. They said, here's the money, make the weapons, you don't have the money to spend on improving the waste. Well, that's in some sense passing the buck, because again I feel, had the enterprise really felt that what was going to happen 40 years down the pike was of the utmost importance, we would have all mobilized. We would have got the Joint Committee behind us. We would have got Glenn Seaborg. We would have got the President of the United States behind us, and we would have done the problem 30 years ago. And of course, as you look at the technology, there's no reason why we couldn't have done the whole thing 30 years ago and done it perfectly adequately.
But do you think you could have gotten that support if you had pounded the table more? Or
I don't know. As I say, my main
more
regret,
second guessing.
My main regret, as I think about my years at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was that I didn't pound the table much more vigorously than I did on that particular issue.
Well, speaking of you and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, why you and Oak Ridge National Laboratory? You're hardly a native Southerner. I'm sure you had opportunities. You sound to me, just on the surface, more like Argonne or Brookhaven. How come you, a Tennessean?
Well, most people don't quite remember that the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which during the war was called Clinton Laboratories, was a daughter of the original metallurgical laboratory, which was established at the University of Chicago to develop the methods of producing plutonium. Two daughter laboratories were established in 1943. One was the Argonne National Laboratory, became the Argonne National Laboratory. The other was Clinton Laboratories here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And the purpose of the original Clinton Laboratories was to build a chain reactor that could produce about 1 gram of plutonium every day in order to test the chemical separation methods that were then to be used at Hanford. Now, because the laboratory was an offshoot of the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, there were many people from Chicago, University of Chicago, which was the contractor both of the Metallurgical Laboratory and of Clinton Laboratories in the original days. Many people from Chicago moved lock, stock, and barrel from Chicago to Oak Ridge. I was involved in the nuclear design. In fact, I did the nuclear design for the so-called X-10 reactor, which is now a National Historical Landmark. And I used to visit Oak Ridge in 1943. I, at that time, was a member of Eugene Wigner's theoretical group, which was responsible for the design of the original Hanford reactors. That was really Eugene Wigner's invention. I was one of his assistants. And towards the end of the war, Eugene Wigner was thinking about how to continue the development of nuclear energy, and he hit upon the idea of converting the Clinton laboratories, which at that time was a small pilot plant, about 800 people worked at the laboratory during the war, converting it into a large-scale national laboratory. And many of the people who surrounded Wigner came down to Oak Ridge to help in making that transformation. I was the first of the group to come to Oak Ridge, and I think we landed in Oak Ridge in May of 1945.
Well, I'm not thinking quite so much of why you came, but why you stayed. What is it that kept you here, and what was the challenge of Oak Ridge National Laboratory that would keep a person of your opportunities and stature?
Well, it's rather interesting. In 1946, Wigner came down to Oak Ridge to be the director of the laboratory, and he stayed for a year. After he left, there was a great deal of milling around because the University of Chicago had left. Monsanto was operating the laboratory for a couple of years. Monsanto wanted to move the laboratory to St. Louis, which the Atomic Energy Commission did not countenance. And so then Union Carbide came in. At that time, there was a manhunt, if you like, trying to find somebody who would become the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And the situation looked so bleak for the laboratory at that time that although some 15 very able people were contacted, I think it was about 15, and not one would accept the job as the director of what was then called the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Finally, the Union Carbide Company turned to me and they said, well, Alvin, we can't get anybody from the outside. Would you like to be the director of the laboratory? If you don't want to be the director, you can be the research director, you can be the associate director. Make your choice. Well, I was a young fellow. Let's see, in 1948, I was roughly 32 years old. I didn't have anything to lose, and it looked like an interesting challenge to me. More than that, I felt that the situation, which most of these people who had been contacted for the directorship didn't quite understand, the situation basically had in it elements of great promise. And therefore I said, yeah, I'll be the associate director, and then I became the research director. Clarence Larson came in 1955, became the director.
You mentioned Eugene Wigner. Would it be safe to say, in your background, that he was one of your role models? Or?
Oh, well, he was the person that had by far the greatest influence on my scientific career. Mm-hmm. One must realize that Wigner, who was a theoretical physicist, who was a refugee from Hitler, basically, who had the deepest concern during the war that the Germans were going to get the bomb first, and that should they get the bomb, Hitler would rule the world, not the United States or the Western powers. And he therefore worked at an impossible rate to achieve the first chain reaction that would produce plutonium. And I was one of his main assistants, Gail Young, who died recently and was an assistant director at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of his other primary assistants. And he was our boss. We took our cue very much from him. He, in effect, was not only our role model, but we sort of worshipped him, and to this day I continue to worship him. And in a sense, it's been my great good fortune to be intimately connected with an intellect, a scientific intellect of the very highest order. If you are close to Eugene Wigner, you know what a scientific brain operating at the very highest order is capable of. And therefore, I suppose I tend to be less than impressed by most other scientists, because most other people in science don't measure up to Eugene Wigner. But that's great. I think as the director of the laboratory, it's great that my standard was Eugene Wigner. And therefore, I always tried, insofar as I could, to maintain that kind of standard at the laboratory. Of course, none of us, including certainly not myself, were scientists of that extraordinary genius.
Alvin, they called them national laboratories, but weren't they primarily national nuclear laboratories?
Oh, yes, that was a little ploy that the Atomic Energy Commission was responsible for. There's no such thing as a national laboratory. Atomic Energy Commission just said, okay, we will start calling these institutions national laboratories. There was no act of Congress that said they will now be called national laboratories. It was called Clinton Laboratories. Argonne was called Argonne Laboratory. And then they converted Clinton Laboratories, presto changeo, into Clinton National Laboratories, and then into Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the name has stuck ever since. And I suppose it's, in a way, sort of fortunate, because given that they have this title of national laboratories, despite the fact that they were atomic energy laboratories, that gave us carte blanche. At least I always felt we had carte blanche to make the laboratories live up to this name and to become not only energy laboratories or nuclear energy laboratories, but national laboratories in a much broader sense. And of course, as you know, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory now spends a good deal of money that is does not come from the Department of Energy.
And that was mostly, I think, your doing, which
Well,
maybe we can talk about. Well, I associate the idea of the laboratory being something more than a nuclear laboratory with you. Do you not take credit for that?
I gave a speech in 1955, gosh, that's 35 years ago, in which I raised the question, what do we do with the national laboratories when the problems of nuclear energy have been resolved? And at that time, I was much more optimistic about all the central problems being solved in a rather short time. And I said, well, they're going to have to seek other opportunities. And one of the directions I suggested that they move into was, well, I called it large-scale geological and geographic engineering. I wasn't very specific on that, but in a certain sense, the involvement with the greenhouse effect and global climate is an aspect of that.
Well, obviously, all of the problems of nuclear energy are not solved, but it's the national laboratories are involved in other things. Alvin, thank you very much. I hope we can continue this shortly. There's a lot more to talk about that I'd like to talk about with you.